Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us. Welcome to Faces of Gene Therapy. My guest today is Donna Christensen, a respected colleague of mine at the Institute for Gene Therapies. Donna is the chair of IGT's Scientific, Academic, and Medical Council. However, she's also a former colleague of mine in Congress. She served 9 terms as a delegate from the U.S. Virgin Islands. She was the very first female physician to serve as a member of Congress in the history of the U.S. Congress. Donna also served on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, including its Health Subcommittee. She chaired the Congressional Black Caucus's Health Brain Trust for 16 years. She practiced family medicine and served in several public health administrative positions prior to her election to Congress back in 1996. And in addition to her work with IGT, Donna sits on several boards and serves as a public health advisor today to the Virgin Islands Department of Health. So we're going to dive right into it and hear some of her perspectives and insights on the issues surrounding gene therapy. Donna, thanks for taking some time. It's great to visit with you and see you again.
It's great to be with you too, and looking forward to our conversation.
Donna, gene therapy has the power, as you know, to fundamentally change the course of disease, but only if patients are diagnosed in time. Maybe talk a little bit about how advancing newborn screening and early diagnosis can unlock the full value of gene therapy. And what are some of the policy steps that are most critical right now today to help make that promise real for families?
Yes, and this is an area that I'm really passionate about having our as much screening done as we can. Um, Babies, when they're born, don't always show the sign of any genetic or molecular disease. So, um, testing is critical, and I hope that the reauthorization, which has lapsed for the last almost 5 years, will be done this year. And we're glad to see that new diseases have been added. And I'm sure we will be looking to add many, many more. But when someone has a genetic disease, uh, it takes time sometimes for the symptoms to appear. But all the while, damage is being done to that individual. And so the earlier that we can identify genetic transmitted disease in a baby, the better it is because we can stop all of the changes that might interfere with his growing up, even life itself. Um, we can stop those, and the child can go on to live a pretty normal life. And it saves it. I know the cost is a problem, but it saves money. One of the things we need to do, though, and the bill that's before Congress right now includes it, is not only the reauthorization, but the advisory committee no longer exists. And it puts the path to adding new genetic diseases to the screening in limbo. So that's really critical. It was disbanded about earlier this year, and that's a very important thing that needs to be done.
And of course, your continued work with our Scientific Academic Medical Council and engaging policymakers on this topic hopefully is going to see some progress on legislative initiatives like that as we continue to educate policymakers to being able to help these families.
One other thing is that apparently around 14,000 babies are found to have a genetically born disease through the screening every year. I'm sure many of them are lost to follow up. I'm sure many of the families don't even know that there's something that is wrong that can be treated. And so the bill also includes more support for follow up to those that are identified. And I think that's another important issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Also, gene therapy science is moving faster. It's moving a lot faster than our traditional policy frameworks that are designed to handle healthcare. Where do you see the biggest disconnects today across the FDA regulation, reimbursement, and coverage? And how can more targeted, practical reforms help close the gap between discovery and delivery of gene therapies?
Well, I'm sure you know because we've all experienced first getting Congress to understand the payment issues. Uh, it's very difficult to get, and well, let me just go back to some of my experience in trying to get CBO to understand that if we paid for something up front, we would save money later on. Almost impossible. So I hope that that's changed in the 10 years since I've been gone, but getting the policymakers to really understand the importance. Um, the payment is a, a major barrier. Many insurers don't want to pay or delay the payment. And we already said how important getting the treatment in a timely basis, how important that is. So I think FDA needs to strengthen its relationship with the insurers to let them know, especially when we're talking about accelerated approval, that when they've given that accelerated approval, that has been studied, it has been validated, and that they should go ahead and pay for the service. We also there have been some institutions that have done assessments to the cost over the long period without the treatment, but I think those need to be improved and expanded on as well. I'm not sure how much the cost to the caregivers is included, and many of the other impacts. I think they look at whether the person improves health-wise, but and maybe the hospitalizations are also looked at as something that where money is saved. But I think there's a lot more that needs to be incorporated as we look at what the long-term costs would be versus this one-time treatment that lasts a lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned caregiver costs and that burden. Gene therapies challenge how we are thinking about value, especially when a new one-time treatment can help prevent decades of medical costs and that chronic care management, which is so expensive, as we know. Also, the caregiver burden and lost productivity. How should policy,
Lost productivity, yes, definitely. It
yes,
just
lost
disrupts
productivity.
families.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, how should policymakers and payers, be redefining value, right? So it reflects long-term outcomes and equity and real-world impact rather than just the short-term costs.
Well, I think that's part of what we were just talking about, the fact that the caregivers cost, the cost to productivity, because the caregivers may have a job, but they often can't even get to work. And we're talking about productivity in the person who's being treated. If we can help a person to stay alive long enough to contribute to society, and be well enough to do that, that also strengthens productivity for our country, and for the communities in which they live. So there's so many things that need to go into consideration with the value, not just the treatment itself. So the caregivers, whether how it impacts the family's life, the rarity of the disease, because that's often a barrier when it's just one or two people that need to be treated um, with this what is now a high cost. So those are some of the things that I think we need to look at, but we also need to examine payment methods. We focus a lot at IGT and on value-based payments, and I know you can talk a lot about how that works, but we need more flexibility in the payments. Those assessments ought to be taken into consideration. The value of the treatment all of the things that create the value for the treatment need to be taken into consideration as we look at value-based payments. We need to look at outcome-based payments, and we need the flexibility to be able to uh, transform a payment system for what is a transformative treatment.
You know,
That's a IGT saying.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, that flexibility is really important. And IGT, fortunately, thanks to your leadership with the SAM Council and our patient community, we've been very successful on a bipartisan basis at getting policymakers to pay attention to those important redefinitions of value, and hopefully focusing and making sure that more flexibility is included for payment and reimbursement so that patients can actually realize these new treatments coming online.
The patient is the most powerful spokesperson for all of this, really. And I went through some of that. I found a family member over in Europe through Ancestry, and it turns out that one of the grandchildren in the family has Bart's syndrome. And it took them 10 years to get something finally approved in September of this year. But it was a lot of advocacy on the part of the patients. And second to the patients, I think, is the SAM, the scientific, academic, and medical community, which can support the patient advocacy council and bring some real scientific information to that advocacy.
And we kind of talked a little bit about this, but breakthroughs often come through small but meaningful steps, whether it's regulatory flexibility, pilot programs, or reimbursement innovation. But why do these little incremental advances matter so much in gene therapy? And how can policymakers better appreciate their life-changing impact for patients that are waiting today?
Yeah, every little step that we make in discovering treatments or even learning more about treatments that are already being used. Because sometimes the treatment's being used for one thing and you find that it may be helpful in other areas as well. So every step that we can make forward, big or small, makes a difference in whether someone gets that treatment, whether it's in payment, whether it's in screening, whether it's in improving and expanding on the accelerated approval process. Every little step makes a big difference in the lives of patients and their families.
Absolutely. As a doctor, you know that behind every policy debate are the patients and the families that are navigating rare and devastating conditions. From your experience as a physician and as a member of Congress, what do patients' stories teach us? What should policymakers and families alike know about where gene therapy is headed next?
The patients and their families are really, as I said earlier, the key advocates for gene therapy because they're living the issue. And so many of them, and some who have joined us on Capitol Hill, have actually lost children because the treatment was not available. And that's very painful to hear. But then we've also had individuals who had children in clinical trials, and the trial had to be stopped because the child was doing so well and continues to do well. So the patient involvement in changing policy, improving policy, improving the way FDA approves the new gene treatments is really key. Now, I don't remember the rest of your question. What was it?
Well, obviously, as policymakers, I just remember my time as serving as a member of Congress, as I'm sure you do, that when we had the opportunity to meet with constituents who had real stories and real anecdotes about their life situations, it reflected on an opportunity as a policymaker to make a difference for those folks. And I think now that
Absolutely.
in those policy debates, we're going to see patients and families navigating some of these rare and devastating conditions with an opportunity for gene therapies to help these folks if policymakers are paying attention about the opportunity.
From my personal experience, not in practice, I probably had some genetic diseases that weren't even identified yet. As I look back on some of the young people that developed some unusual symptoms and often didn't, at least two that didn't make it. But looking at the journey that the Barth's Foundation went through, it was the patients that they gathered together who made a lot of sacrifices to travel to Washington or wherever the committee that now doesn't exist would meet to advocate and to share their stories, to share their stories. My family, the grandson in the family is now about 14. He's not going to be eligible for the treatment. But even those families that where the youngster died or the youngster has been able to grow into teenage years are still advocating very much for, were still advocating because they know how important it is, even though their child could not benefit.
Well, Donna, it's been just such a pleasure working with you and having you be a part of the IGT team to make sure that we're engaging stakeholders across the gene therapy landscape to explore how gene therapies are moving from scientific promise to now real world impact, and looking at all those initiatives that might stand in their way, but working through those initiatives for progress for patients, as you mentioned. So thanks for all your great work.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. That's why I'm so glad to be a part of the IGT team because I've worked for so many years on health equity and the work that we do and that the patients and our corporate advisory and the SAM Council are doing helps to make sure that these transformative treatments will be available to everyone who needs them.